All right, go ahead.
We are presenting today on Stark 1 and 2 legislation. We're going to start out by talking about the Honorable Fortney Pete Stark. We have a lovely picture of him here for you to look at. He was born November 11th, 1931 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. After a lot of schooling, he was able to earn an MBA in 1960, and then he worked as a bank executive for about 10 years. At that point, he decided to run for Congress, and he was able to get a seat in Congress representing one of the districts in California. And after that, he actually stayed in Congress from 1973 to 2013, which is the second longest run that anybody has had in Congress. That's a long time, 40 years that he was in Congress. And he represented 3 different districts in California over that time. And the reason he's important for this presentation is because he is the author of Stark 1 and Stark 2 legislation. So the rationale for Stark Law. The main thing that Stark Law does is it prevents physician self-referral. So self-referral is when a physician refers a patient to another facility where he has some sort of financial holding. So he gets extra money for sending that patient to that place. For example, if he owns an ambulatory surgery center, sorry if I said that wrong, and then he refers a patient to go there to have surgery, then he'll get extra money since he owns that place. And that'd be a problem with Stark Law. And the reason that we have this Stark Law is because it creates conflicts of interest where physicians financially benefit from medical referrals. It increases healthcare costs from overuse of referrals, because if physicians are getting extra money for referring their patients to these places, they're more likely to give more referrals that aren't necessarily necessary. And it can also limit competition with other providers, because the patients will be stuck in this cycle of where the physicians are referring them to. So Stark 1 included Medicare services, and then Stark 2 is also important because it widened the scope to include Medicaid and also clarifies many points of the law. So enforcement. Policing is done by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, mainly through CMS. Like I mentioned before, this is covering Medicare and Medicaid services. So you better believe CMS is going to have a large hand in making sure that they're not being taken advantage of there. And policing is also done by the Department of Justice. And enforcement has become more strict since the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So currently, enforcement of this is pretty intense. Now, penalties for breaking Stark Law include denial of payment for services provided, or a refund to CMS if already paid. So obviously, if a physician is breaking this rule, then he's going to have to not get paid for those services that he gave or she gave. There's also up to $15,000 fine per occurrence, and then up to $100,000 fine per arrangement from each party. There's also possible jail time involved and exclusion from CMS in the future, which could be very difficult for a lot of facilities, I'm sure. CMS does a lot.
Okay, so Stark 1, fraud and abuse. So this law was passed in 1989, which precluded physicians from referring patients to clinical laboratories with which a physician or immediate family member had a financial relationship. And so this just covered the basis of like what physicians couldn't do to gain a profit or gain more money. So it goes on. The concern that brought about the Stark Law 1 was the fact that physicians were adding additional unnecessary tests that benefited them financially. And Whitney also covered that a little bit as well. The Stark 1 law was at first just for the safety of patients because they can't be held accountable to any additional tests that they did not ask for. So this originally meant to prevent physician self-referrals on Medicare claims only. And as Whitney said earlier, case law now appears which shows the self-referrals are not allowed for both Medicare and Medicaid. And this goes into Stark 2. So Stark 2 is the basic thing, physician self-referral, and as you can see, it was passed a long time ago. It was passed in 1993 and 1994, around that time, and Congress expanded the prohibition to additional DHS and applied certain aspects of the physician self-referral law to the Medicaid program, as I said earlier. Stark 2 also prohibits a physician from making referrals for certain designated health services in the DHS payable Medicare to an entity with which he or she or an immediate family member has a financial relationship. So basically ownership, investment, or compensation. And we have some slides on that as well, about the ownership that they have. And so unless an exception applies, and those exceptions are mainly legal. So along with Stark 2, there were more revisions over the years. Basically, there were phase 2s, phase 3s that added more to the laws and basically made it more applicable. Also, the Affordable Care Act that helped as well, and more enforcing. And this also, along with the other points, it prohibited the entity from presenting or causing to be presented claims to Medicare, and establishing a number of specific exceptions and grants. Also, I thought this was interesting. The Secretary had the authority to create regulatory exceptions for financial relationships that do not pose a risk of program or patient abuse. And so I thought that was just interesting to add as well to the Stark 2. Also, the Stark Law also prohibits the submission or causing the submission of claims for DHS that are furnished as a result of prohibited referrals. And the next slide is the services in DHS, which the physician cannot provide a self-referral that they have any relationship to in an organization or anything like that. And these are just the services that are applied to DHS. And these next couple slides are about the relationships and of the physician to the organization or laboratory or anything like that. And first is financial relationships. This is probably the biggest one because there's 4 different types: direct ownership or investment interest, indirect ownership or investment interest, direct compensation arrangement, or indirect compensation arrangement. And I'll go more into depth in the next slides about direct and indirect compensations. So this financial relationship, also the law imposes self-reporting requirements on all businesses that bill Medicare and Medicaid. So this, upon the request of DHS Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or the OIG, a business must report its ownership, investments, and compensation arrangements, including covered services it provides and the names and the physician identification numbers of all doctors with investment interests or compensation agreements, or with immediate family members with such interests. So this basically pretty much set it in stone of they need to provide this information up front. And also the informed consent, the next point kind of goes along with the first point. So self-referral has a potential to restrict physicians' disclosures to patients, and as a result, compromised patients have a right to exercise informed consent and choice. So this is something that the Stark Law does for those people, and informed consent that protects them from misdiagnosis from financial incentives. So in the end, sound medical judgment can be used when there isn't anything to gain from referrals that are used for the right purpose. So this is basically the patient's way of going, I'm going to be protected and get the best service that I need, not just for the physician's financial gain. And these next slides are the direct and indirect compensations. So I just wrote down some examples of the direct compensations and the ownerships in the organizations that the physician has. And those are physician renting an office space from a hospital. So that gives them ownership a little bit, and hospital employing a physician. So the physician may be working somewhere, but they are employed as, or have some kind of agreement with another hospital. Hospital renting equipment from a physician, nursing home paying physician as an, etc. Independent contractor to serve as the physician itself and referring them to services that they provided as well, and homes medical director. And the next one is the last slide, is indirect compensation. Indirect compensation is basically just the unbroken chain between the physician and entity. So it has like a relationship over the years. And I actually have an example. The physician owns stock in a for-profit hospital. So that is an indirect compensation. So the hospital's contracts with the clinical laboratory to provide services to the hospital's patients, an unbroken chain basically. So it has a stock, and it doesn't basically have ownership, but it has something invested into that hospital that they refer the patient to. And that is the ownership and the compensations that physicians have. And those are basically the more in-depth explanations around Stark 1 and Stark 2. And that's it. On the next page is our references.
Awesome. Great work, both of you. You did a really good job of covering the topic. It's an important topic in healthcare. making sure we're not violating those Stark laws. But yeah, great job. So I'm going to ask you each the same question, and I'll start with Whitney and then William, same question. Whitney, let me go ahead and the question for you, Whitney, is what was the most interesting thing that you learned when you were studying this topic? And it looks like you're on mute if you want to take it off mute. Yep, there you go.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't know I did that.
Yeah.
Well, the most interesting thing I learned, I didn't really find a way to work it into the presentation, but every time I searched for Stark Law, the main things that popped up were blogs from doctors that were complaining about Stark Law and articles from medical journals about how Stark Law is so annoying. So it was just interesting to me that this is one of those things that people in the field really hate, I think, because I think it has a lot of red tape that people have to work around, and that makes it difficult for them.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of red tape involved, and you got to be very careful to make sure you're not violating it.
Yeah.
All right, William, same question.
So the interesting thing that I found was basically when I was looking up Stark Law, it was kind of hard to pinpoint down some actual facts about the legislation, because yes, it is an important legislation, but whenever I looked it up, it also brought up the Anti-Kickback and False Claims Act. And so I was like, oh, is this part of Stark Law? That's basically what I thought. So it was confusing, but the more I read into it, they were pretty much kind of in relationship with each other to provide more safety for the patient. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And that's actually what some of the reading this week also included as well. So.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you both again. That was fantastic. Really did a great job of covering it. So I'll go ahead and stop recording, but stay.